Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. If my voice drops suddenly, it's because I'm just recovering from a cold, so bear with me. So thank you for joining us this evening for tonight's conversation towards ending museum violence, which will be led by Andrea Carlson and Heid E. Erdrich. Before I welcome our guests and kick things off, I would like to take a moment to honor the fact that we are on Dakota land. This is the ancestral home of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk people who were forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. We make this acknowledgement to honor the Dakota people, also our ancestors and descendants, as well as the land itself. So this evening's program is presented in conjunction with Nicholas Galanin's exhibition, Everything You've Ever Been, Everything We Are Right Now. Throughout Nicholas's practice, he addresses the pervasive impacts of capitalism, the continuation of colonialization of both human and non-human bodies, and the misrepresentation and misappropriation of indigenous culture. And he does all this in an effort to evidence the damages that this has done. So we'll think about some of those things as well and how they may connect to our conversation tonight. I'd also like to make a note that this evening's program is being recorded, so if you have any objections to that, please take any needed action to make yourself comfortable this evening. We're glad to work with you on that. And bits of housekeeping, our bathrooms are located down the hall and to the left, and you're welcome to use the bathroom that best represents your gender identity. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. Andrea Carlson, Ojibwe, is a visual artist who currently lives in Chicago, Illinois. Through painting and drawing, Carlson cites entangled cultural narratives that come from institutional authority over objects and the people who make objects. Current research activities include Indigenous Futurism and assimilation metaphors in film. Her work has been acquired by the British Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the National Art Gallery in Canada, and you were also awarded a McKnight Fellow and a Joan for Foundation for Painters Fellow. And then we have Heid E. Erdrich, who is Ojibwe and enrolled at Turtle Mountain. She is an author of 8 books of poetry and prose and is an interdisciplinary artist. Heid has curated dozens of art exhibitions focused on Native American artists. We've also collaborated with Rosie Seamus Dance since 2016, as well as contributed to works by Ananya, Zarango Flamenco, and among others. You've written plays produced by Pangea World Theater, and you've performed your poetry across the country, often collaborating with other musicians, visual artists, and dancers. Your first exhibit as a featured artist was Skew Lines, which occurred in May of 2019, which was created in a dual residency with Rosie Seamus for Sioux Visual Arts Center. Following Heid and Andrea's conversation, we will welcome a short Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to Heid and Andrea.
Thank you much. So when Heid and I often talk about working with museums and problems that museums have and how we're often brought on as advisors in the capacity of advisors, even though neither of us work within museums. We don't necessarily get paychecks from museums usually. So I think that after hours and hours of conversations about our experiences, when Jared reached out and asked if I was willing to talk on Nick Galanins' work, or in context of this show, I was thinking about his work, sort of the essay for the catalog, and how his work addresses violence. And I wanted to talk about how museums are also promoting violence and how museums can push that onto our communities, and they're usually very problematic spaces. So this is what we came up with. Does anyone know the microphone works? If I sit like this, is that what I want?
Are they too close to, or ours too close to each other?
I don't know why I'm looking at Fritz, but I'm looking
Okay, we're gonna be okay.
So first I wanted to talk about land acknowledgement statements. They're very, very popular. A lot of museums are starting to do land acknowledgements, and they may not have an existing relationship with the communities, but they want to check this box. They definitely want to have a land acknowledgement, but it's not necessarily sure, I'm not necessarily sure if that matches a desire to actually know Native people. So one of the things I found interesting is this statement by the New Red Order. They're a group out of New York of Indigenous, it's like an Indigenous artist collective where artists come and go. And this was written, this is part of a statement that they wrote for the Whitney. Efforts to decolonize institutions are embodied in ritual acts of acknowledging Indigenous presence and claims to territory. Within what is currently called the United States, these acknowledgements are increasingly, if only recently, understood as prerequisites for demonstrating engagement with Indigenous communities. However, without continuous commitment to serve as accomplices to Indigenous people, institutional gestures of acknowledgement risks reconciling settler guilt and complicity and rescuing settler futurity. And it has a line for the specific terms. I think that is a really important statement. There's a desire by museums to extract Native knowledge, but not necessarily put us in positions of power.
Yeah, when land acknowledgement statements became a thing, they sprung up everywhere at once. And it was curious to me because here I live in Minnesota, and there's a lot of Native nations in Minnesota. 11 Native nations in Minnesota, I think. And it wasn't a thing here yet. So that was really curious to me. I would go around the country, as is my job, and I would go someplace and people would sometimes say to me, "Can you do a land acknowledgement?" And I would think, no, I just got here. And then so I looked into what did we do traditionally? How did we go into one another's territories? And I decided to take that on. So if anybody asked me, I would say, hello, if anybody from the original people of this place is present, will you give me leave to speak? And took the risk that if they said no, then I wouldn't speak. And if they wanted to speak before me, they were allowed to, or that I would welcome that and make the agreement that that was going to happen. Pretty soon after I decided to do that, I was in Utah with a group that was working on Bears Ears, and I hope I get a little chance to talk about the Bears Ears area. And I said, if anybody from the original people of this place is present, and a woman came up, and she said she was the tribal chairwoman, the chief of her people, and Ute group. And she gave a very quick conversation, or not conversation, kind of maybe like a benediction, I guess. And then, thankfully, she got off the stage. Had I been an Ojibwe person, I probably would still be there right now. But Ute peoples were quick. So that worked out, and then, but I continued for the next about year and a half going around doing that, and I was asked by someone to write an essay about land acknowledgements, and I said, I can't, I have land acknowledgement fatigue. But I did do something, and it's on, last year it was published on Powell's books in Portland. It's on their website, so if you just Google land acknowledgement fatigue, I think I'm the only thing that comes up. But I do say to people too, that if you want me to acknowledge something, I will say we are all on stolen land.
And I think it's another point to that is don't ask Native people to write land acknowledgements. The real struggle of figuring out whose land you occupy doesn't belong to the Indigenous people of the land. The struggle belongs to the person who needs to learn where they live. I know where I live, and I've always known Indigenous communities on the land that I live on. So it's not really my burden to bear.
But I like to think the reason they weren't so much a trend in Minnesota is that there's actual relationships that institutions have over the course of many years begun to forge with Native people and Native communities, and especially Ojibwe, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk people. So I think that's a little bit what we'll talk about tonight too.
Yeah.
It's a relationship, is what really we want acknowledged.
I agreed. I would also say that even though like land acknowledgements are an Indigenous protocol that we know whose territory we're trespassing on or in, after the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed, one of the outcomes of it was that the Indigenous communities in Canada was saying, we want land acknowledgements. We want them for sports games. We want them before lectures. We want settlers to know whose land they're on, that this is a big problem, that people just occupy space without even realizing where they're trespassing. So land acknowledgements did come out of a lot of Indigenous labor and a lot of Indigenous activism, so I don't want to be overly critical of that work that has gone into that as well. And now that's it's becoming more popular across the border. So I'm going to move on. I think the idea of the title of this talk with towards ending museum violence, there's some very strong words. Violence is a very strong word, and a number of people, when you say that, they think of museums where you go and you learn about things. How on earth does a museum be violent? And the title is also non-committal because it's towards. It's not actually ending it. We're always moving towards this thing that we might not ever be able to solve. Heid and I do not have the answer. We do not know how to solve it. We do not know how to end this thing, but we know how to observe it. And I think that those are some first steps. And we have some ideas. So I want to start with an image. James Luna, he died in 2018, but he, of course, is in the Fuck You t-shirt, and then this image is kind of put next to an image of Ishi, who was the last of the Ahi. They say the last of the Ahi tribe, but there was a number of other people who had survived around him from his language group. But he was found like this image of him in a coat. You can kind of see his ribs sticking out in his chest. What had happened was some land surveyors came through in California where he was living, and he and his family ran away because they had experienced a lot of violence and a lot of terrifying experiences with settlers. So they left everything behind, all of the stuff that would get them through the winter. And the land surveyors found, came across all these things, packaged it all up and stole it, brought it home. And there's some accounts that say that those objects ended up in museum collections. So he and his family his family didn't survive the winter, and this is how he emerged in the spring all by himself. And so what do you do with a person who is the last of his people, which is a very romantic concept, the last of the Mohicans, first thing and lasting, if you're interested, Jeannie O'Brien's book, First Thing and Lasting, to read the criticism on that. So he was actually put in prison. That's what you do with the last of a people. And he was held there, and he became news all across the country. It just blew up that there was this last of his people, and the Smithsonian, the early Smithsonian, Berkeley found out about him, a professor at Berkeley, and they came and he became a ward of the museum and a ward of the school, and he was put on display in like human zoos. We don't really know his name. Ishi just means man in his language because there's a cultural prohibition on saying your own name, so that just means man. He died of tuberculosis not terribly long after he was taken into captivity, and he requested on his deathbed that he not be put on display after his death, that he be put in the ground according to the traditions of his people so he could reunite with his family. And that did not happen. His brain was taken out and it was held in a museum collection until the 70s before it was repatriated. So when I talk about museum violence, I go always to Ishii first, and I go to James Luna's criticism of museums. James Luna put himself on display in 1986 in a piece called The Artifact Piece in San Diego. The San Diego Museum of Man put himself out on display. The rest of the show had things like his Sex Pistols album record that said authentic Indian music by it. His body was labeled next to him, like various scars explaining his body. But he's talking about the display of Native people as curiosities, as what museums were founded in, collecting from Native people with the anticipation of our demise, anticipation of our posterity, as us being of the past. And that's really, when museums were collecting at that time in the colonies, it was a power move. We're collecting these things because we anticipate people are going to be assimilated or killed. And we're collecting them because we are buying futures in their demise. We're buying futures in their genocide. It's a terrible prediction, and these are the spaces that now Native artists present our work in. It's emotionally terribly complicated. Do you want to talk about Ichi?
Maybe a little bit about our conversation about violence, and one of the things that creates ongoing violence is what is in a collection and the relationship that Indigenous people might have to the object in the collection, and how something that may seem, maybe distasteful but not violent to other people, like having a piece of rope from the hanging of the Dakota 38 on display, or even if you don't display them, having bodies and bones and funereal items in your collection. And I think about how we walk down the corridors in the basement of the Field Museum in Chicago, and without being prepared ahead of time, having someone point to a long, dark corridor while we were in a long, dark corridor, and I had no idea how I would get out of there if I didn't have a guide, being told, oh, down there is where the bodies are, And it is a violence. That sort of thing is a violence, no matter how gently you do it, because these are people who are there because of acts of war. Their bodies are taken as token or as, war trophy in many ways. I believe that to be how it's perceived. But then I also think about the science of trauma and how a reaction to something like that might be different if your values that you've grown with, or the values that you have been taught, are that things have their own story. Story might be alive to a lot of people, as it is for Ojibwe people, and having that caged is like having a relative caged. Your ancestor is no different than your sister. You are to be in relationship in that same way. So to have those things done of violence, of being caged or taken as a trophy, is ongoing, and it goes back and forth across time. So, and we're physically react to it because of our inheritance, our physical inheritance. So I think it's a little bit of a different thing than people might consider what a museum could do to you, or an institution.
So just to be tidy and to be fast, we kind of put together a list, maybe too pragmatic, and some of these points relate more to each other. And we met earlier today, and there's more than 10 points. So this is a lie. I don't know if any of you are going to end up curating, but it doesn't matter. A lot of the points that I have on this list are things that, even as an artist, as a writer, as a student, as anyone that works anywhere, can find creative ways of putting some of these things, some advocacy to to work for Native people as allies of us. I'm terrible reader.
Well, this one is about decisions. You don't do those things without the inclusion of the people who are predicted. It's unethical. It's really, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but it is the majority practice still. People may call in a Native expert who is not actually Native and certainly not from the group. So that happens just because of who's available as museum professionals, so they say, or their inability, the institution to make a relationship with the community that has something to do with the patrimony, as Andrea calls it.
Yeah, we're trying to come up, if anyone in the audience comes up with a better word than patrimony, please let me know. Belongings, things that belong to a culture or a community. I have just how I defined it as our knowledge, our belongings, our sacred things that are definitely ours. Patrimony has the patra, the father, the masculine, and it's like, what about matrimony? It's taken. So I'm totally not fixed on this language. I'm still trying to figure out how to because we have every bit of our power to redefine and rename things. But that's what the museums are using now. So please advise if you don't like my language. I don't. So consult with the appropriate community-specific Native nations about the objects or ideas being displayed or presented. I as an Ojibwe woman, Grand Portage, I don't feel like I could ever be qualified to talk about the code of things. But I will say that as an Ojibwe person, I lean in when it comes to other Indigenous people and communities. I try to be a good diplomat, I try to be a good neighbor, and I try to pay attention. So I will often be in advisory capacity for other nations' sacred objects, and I don't want to displace. I am very aware of my presence displacing other people, and we'll get into that more in moving forward.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that you might not be asked to stand in that role from people from another nation. Like, Cherokee are not up here. If there's something to do with Cherokee, somebody might ask you to step in.
Yeah, that's actually happened. We're talking about Cherokee people.
My best suggestion is to turn that mic off and pass the other one back.
Okay. This one's behaving itself.
Just mute, or is there just
It has a button.
On the bottom.
Yeah, on the bottom it says off.
It says off, but I don't believe it. Okay, there it goes. Okay, I just thought this was a fun image. It maybe sums up some of the point. I think that Black Panthers really got the white curator aspect of curating, even though Wakanda is not a real place in Africa, it is a real place in Illinois. It's an Ojibwe word. It means place of cabbages. That's what Wakanda means. Yeah, but it's partially Potawatomi, that's not Ojibwe. Sorry, this is how we're not even going to see you guys soon enough. Phrases like "not about us, without us" addresses the ongoing problems of non-natives disenfranchising natives from having agency in programs about Native people. I said Native a lot in that sentence. Don't center yourself. Understand that your presence displaces someone else. And I would say that about me. I would say that about other Native people. I would say that about non-Native people. It's really, I think, a really important phrase. It's not a Native phrase. A number of people use that in a number of when it comes to politics and when it comes to inclusion. I don't know. Now that we have to make this official.
That's good, because I would just sit here and listen to Andrea. You can do the next one if you want. Yeah, so one of the things that happens sometimes is that a program, a show, an exhibit, institution will invite artists and then go to the Indigenous or Native community near them and ask for help. And sometimes they do that after they've gotten in serious trouble. And then what you learn is, no, I'm not cleaning up this mess for you. Or many other things. People will step in. There's all sorts of ways that people do get used and have been used. If somebody has the thought that we want to do this, the next thought would be, who in our community is going to? Are we going to contract for American cash dollars to do this? And I think that things go better when that happens.
It actually is probably me. I destroy electronics. It's a superpower. So at this point, on including Native people at the very moment of planning until the completion of the programming, I think is a very important aspect. I think that it could save a lot of institutions the grief that they actually are putting themselves through. As you were saying, I was on a few advisory panels, the last one recently, where we still haven't had, everyone took their time. It was a very emotional day of meetings, and we never had a follow-up. And then the curator that inherited the project, when a story was going to be broken by the Chicago Tribune, quickly emailed everyone to update us 2 seconds before the story broke, that we then all had to quickly have to respond to media requests. That isn't fair. Give Native people a lot of time. I can specifically talk about the show that I'm referencing, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but there was a Mimbres pottery, their burial belonging exhibition at the Chicago Institute for Art, and they brought in on December 2nd a panel of Native people to talk about this exhibition that was slated to open the 20th of May. So there was a very short amount of time. They had been working on the exhibition for 3 years prior, and they had never consulted a single Native person before that. Mimbres pottery are these bowls. They're very lavishly painted. They're the ancestors of the Pueblo people of today, and the Hopi and Zuni people. And how they were buried was they buried their dead and put one of these bowls on their face with this little hole. It's called a kill bowl. When you put a hole in the bottom of a bowl, you can't use it as a bowl anymore. And there's very specific beliefs that I won't go into, but that is just physically how these bowls were excavated. So University of Minnesota and the Minneapolis Institute of Art sent archaeologists in the 1920s to some grave sites, and they dug up over 80 bodies and bowls and brought them back to Minnesota. Those bodies are still in Minnesota. Minnesota, Twin Cities, is the final resting place of Mimbres people. They're dug up in what is now New Mexico. So I knew this history. I knew this story about the Mimbres people. I knew the problem of the college retaining these bodies, about the Weissman Art Museum having this collection. And it was something that I talked a lot about in lectures about my own art on museum studies. Then I moved to Chicago, and one of the first things that happens is that I'm asked to be on an advisory over this collection of 75 Mimbres bowls. And I just felt like I had been followed around my entire career by this hurt over that. So we fought. They ended up, they're indefinitely postponing the exhibition, who knows for how long. The catalog, which had 6 contributors, all settlers, all white people. One of them was a woman. That's a very woke catalog for 2019. But they didn't send it to press, so the catalog was stopped. It's really important not to put out catalogs on Minbray's things, because the Minbray's graves are still around, even though 100% of Minbray's graves have been robbed and looted. Because when the catalogs come out, people desire these things. They're gorgeous. And when people desire them, it makes a market for grave robbed things. And it's really irresponsible to ever put out catalogs on grave robbed things. So when we were having this discussion, it was also during a government shutdown. Our ancestors are often buried in national parks. When the government shuts down, there are grave robbers waiting for the government to shut down so they can go into national parks and rob our graves. This is very, very real. So I'll get more into this later.
Yeah, and part of the tragedy or the insult and assault of what happened with Bears Ears being designated a national monument and then very publicly being made open is that thousands and thousands of things have been looted out of Bears Ears in a short time. That beautiful area that some places hadn't been touched, they thought for 7,000 years no one had lived there or walked there, and everything was as left. Very similar to Minbray's situation, and so I think that the ongoingness of this is important. And I just wanted to just clarify, it's not that our ancestors were buried in national parks. It's that national parks came after here. That's all over the place. They're just important historic places, But that's one of the reasons it's important to think about institutions, because institutional land was sometimes granted to people from land that had been specifically cited because it was important to Native people, and basilicas spring up where mounds were built and that sort of thing. So educational institutions spring up where land had been, last taken from Native nations nearby, or they ceded it for whatever reasons.
Just what our next slide is.
Oh yeah, our next slide is.
This is a you.
Oh, this is a me. Did any of you recognize what is in this slide? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the hanging of the Dakota 38, and it's Currier and Ives lithograph, like celebrating the event,
Yeah.
protest.
Yeah.
I don't need to make anyone stare at this.
Yeah. We just wanted to, that, of course, one of the biggest messes to clean up was what happened at the Walker. So I think that, yeah, she'll talk about it.
Let's talk about Leanne first.
Yeah, eventually we're going to talk about some interventions that we've been watching and following, and I like to think about cross-disciplinary interventions because I think it's really important when you're looking for leadership with institutions that they're models in a variety of forms. And Leanne Howe created, some of you might remember she taught at the University of Minnesota. She's Choctaw from Oklahoma. She's now in an endowed chair at University of Georgia, Athens, and she created this beautiful book with the cover by Andrea Carlson called Savage Conversations. It is labeled on the back as fiction, published by Coffee House Press. It is written as a play in verse. It is made between three characters. The characters are Noble Savage, or I'm sorry, the Savage, Indian Savage, who is Dakota, and Mary Todd Lincoln, the person who had been the wife of President Lincoln. It's based on research of Mary Todd's time in a sanitarium for her mental health issues and her, turns out, laudanum addiction. And the third character is just a performative character who never has lines but has actions, and that character is the rope. And it's the rope that was on exhibit from the Minnesota Historical Society that was taken from the hanging of the Dakota 38. So it's an interrogation of the connections between Mary Todd Lincoln's insanity and her documented belief that a savage Indian came in every night and tortured her, and why she would be tortured by those things, and one of Lincoln's behaviors might have created that delusion in her experience.
Let's stay on the Dakota 38 for a second. So, as many of you know or may not know, I'm not sure, I don't want to do maybe a raise of hands, but the artist Sam Durant, in 2017, they were installing this scaffold that had maybe, I can't remember the exact details, but maybe 7 different devices used to hang people. But the overall structure, especially from the first slide of this group, you can see the apparatus that the Dakota 38 were hung simultaneously. The December 26th, within like the day after Christmas in 1862. It's the Dakota 38 plus 2 because 2 Dakota men fled to Canada, and they were hung the next year, I think. They were hunted down in Canada and brought back. Little Six and Medicine Bottle were their names. So they were simultaneously hung. Some of the stories talk about how they held hands and sang before they were dropped. They were executed by order of Abraham Lincoln. He reprieved, I think, almost 300 people. He had pretty much any Dakota person that they could find, they put on a list and they sent it. There was no trial. This was in times of war. It is an unusual policy to execute people who are participating in war. The Civil War was going on, of course, at the same time, and the United States did not have a policy of executing people on the South. So this is it's a very odd thing to enter war. It's very tragic, and it's very it's very disgusting blight on Abraham Lincoln's presidency and on U.S. history. But this piece was going up, and of course, being in a sculpture park, it's outside, it's visible. You have to drive by it. A number of Dakota and Ojibwe people who, would have to see this on a daily basis and knew what the structure was immediately. This protest, you can see the sign, "Not Your Story, Respect Dakota People." It's a really interesting how the protest worked out. I learned that a lot of my non-native art friends have really interesting views of Dakota people and Native people in general. I saw all over my Facebook about Dakota people or people who are offended, don't understand contemporary art, and as though as though Sam Durant was on our side, as though he was a sympathetic person to. This is outside. This is an antagonism in our outside spaces. While the South is seeing these Confederate soldiers being taken down, Minnesota decides to put up a sculpture that is antagonizing to community. So I thought I was at this point in Chicago. I had moved, so I wasn't part of the protest. But had I been, I would have pulled in Sam Durant's piece from 2008. This is from the Sydney Biennial. This is on the side of the building. He does these protest signs and light boxes, and I thought this was a very interesting work of Sam Durant's, and he clearly forgot about that.
Early on in the outcry against this piece, I looked back at information that had been out there about the piece before it was objected to, and it was described as being like a play structure. So I think people should understand that. And then also, within the history of the construction of the actual historical apparatus to hang all these people, this had never been done before. It was a war technology test like Gatling guns were in other areas where Native people were massacred, and many other, projects of war were instituted in trying it out on Indians first and Native people first. So I think that maybe Sam didn't know that, I don't know, but certainly it would have a very different weight when it came to the audience of the people who are from this place. The walker sits on land that is close to a Dakota sacred site that's been obliterated, Medicine Spring, just across Dunwoody Avenue, that is dewatered down Hennepin Avenue to the river now. So there were so many things about like the confluence of where that ended up that are not really well known. And he did, kind of enact his, I have to show some respect, he did get advice from a few Native people. He just didn't get a contact from the right Native people, and I don't think the context of how this thing would be constructed was even part of the conversation at that point. So I was really glad that I wasn't not available to take on the educational programming that they'd asked me to do at the time. So.
Scholarly claims that reclassify, dispute, or alienate Native people from our cultural patrimony are ongoing colonial tactics, culturally genocidal and violent. I think that's pretty straightforward, but an example of this would be when I was part of the consultation for the Membraze exhibition. There was an idea that was being floated around that the Membraze things were not the cultural patrimony, or not things of Pueblo people, that they were actually Mayan, and that they had been either relocated or that the Mayan had made them and moved. The reasoning for that is there is these cultural heroes, these twins that kind of battle the fish that's sometimes on some of these objects, and it's like, well, the Mayan also have the hero twins. Well, so did the Ojibwe and every other nation. I'm not going to make a claim on them, even though we have twins in some of our stories. But the idea behind that was, if you can divide these objects from the Pueblo people and claim that they're Mayan, then NAGPRA doesn't apply. And I will get to NAGPRA later, but NAGPRA is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. Okay. So this is the follow-up to that. Divide and conquer is a colonial tactic that takes many forms. And it's dividing natives from their land. It's doubting caste, or like casting doubt on who does this stuff really belong to. There's a loophole in NAGPRA that says if the object is culturally unidentifiable, it doesn't apply. You don't have to return things like bodies. So they'll know where people have come from, where objects have come from, what sacred objects have come from, what community, but they're not sure. So if your institution can avoid being sure, you don't have to return those things. That's divide and conquer. That's, I would say, a very violent approach to holding on to objects.
It's different Native groups against each other too. If they're like, no, it's yours, no, it's ours, or they're different institutions, or even collectors, or people who might be able to release things to other people. So, yeah, it's within the culture groups as well. There's a result. And just to remind people, NAGPRA does not apply to institutions that do not get federal funding. That's the only stick that the federal government had, is to say you can't have funding if you have objects that are supposed to be repatriated.
We've already covered this one a bit.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, the only thing different in that is this idea of outreach, that people might want you to do outreach, and really what it is engagement, and it should be ongoing inclusion, not just at the event, make sure you get a Native audience there, or something along those lines. So that's kind of an ongoing thing that I do happily work with people, because it's not specific. We're not trying to right a wrong. We're not trying to figure out a mistake that people made. We're just going to talk about what true engagement means and how are people engaged every day in the work of your institution rather than just when there's a specific thing that you maybe got funding for because you were going to attract a Native audience?
Also, book centering Native people and outreach is out.
Yeah, it centers Native people. Yeah, that's the other thing too. We thought about the idea of outreaches away from the people, and centering is bringing you in.
Oh, so everything up until everything up until this point, we're talking about Native people as being outsiders to the institution and not having agency within. And this is where that doesn't apply. This is where get natives on the payroll in positions where you have power to stop before your institution is committed to harm. When we come in as advisors, we give a bunch of advice, write a bunch of notes, and then the institution, if they're non-native, can cherry pick what they want and what they don't want. But be in whatever capacity you are, fight for Native people, get us on the payrolls, not me, or Heid in particular, we do like our jobs, but give us real agency within the organization. Not just, oh, that's interesting advice, we'll take it or leave it. Put people in positions of authority where they're making these decisions for themselves because they're invested and vested in those identities for the rest of their life. They're not jumping from topic to topic.
Can I say something scoopy?
Yeah.
I said, can I say something scoopy? If you're a young Native person looking for your training and career, there are so many jobs out there that are in arts and in cultural institutions, in nonprofits that give funding to folks that cannot be filled because they're just looking for Native folks. And I think it's really important to think about that, how your work, any good liberal arts degree will get you there. And yes, it would be great if a generation of people came up who, and institutions were welcoming to them, because there's also a generation of the first people who went into these institutions and were eaten alive and have left where they are because it's just so painful to constantly be asking for a certain level of respect that is not shown to people. But yes, we're artists and writers, and this is not what we were going to do for a job. It's just the extra required thing to do because of ethical concerns and a lot of other things.
I've gotten ahead of myself because I'm still so hopping mad about memories. Never, ever display things stolen from graves. Never. Don't do it. Native American people fought hard to pass NAGPRA. Institutions can develop internal policies that go beyond the guidelines set by NAGPRA and develop a more generous, kind, and humane treatment of Native patrimony. This is in Canada, they have a just blanket rule that you just don't ever put grave objects on display. There are, I think, people from various faiths. I heard that Buddhist people often will have a problem when they go into a museum and they see things from graves, that there's a cultural sensitivity and you don't look at it. Well, that's also true with a lot of Native nations. We don't, rate as highly as organized religion does, but it's true. We don't want to see our ancestors on display, and we don't want to see other people's ancestors on display by colonial institutions that put us on view. It's a degradation. It's a violation. We're seeing our ancestors. We're seeing people who we love, and we're seeing those bodies treated as objects.
And this just was my reminder point to talk about places where NAGPRA doesn't apply, and that is in the millions and millions of objects that were collected privately in this country and that now no longer can find a home at a large institution because they know they cannot be collected, but they're collected from graves and from battle sites. Things that were connected with deaths are also not allowed, but they were once like really a treasure. Again, war trophies in my opinion. And so these things are now going on to markets in auction houses all over the world. There's a huge market with French collectors, and intervention with the auction houses and the people who are selling these things is a big part of historic preservation officers at tribes work. And it's hard to do because it's slippery. They don't publicize the catalogs until the last minute. They'll show it to their usual buyers, but they don't necessarily put it out there where folks can get to it really fast. So there's like a social media campaign to make sure that those things can happen. But there's no reason auction houses can't have a humane policy too, because there are ways that families can be told, and some families will say, yes, I do want to work with the tribe to get this object back to its people. And many things have gone back, including a pipe that was taken from one of the Dakota 38 that were hanged through Jamie Arsenault, who's now the historic preservation officer at White Earth. She saw it being auctioned and recognized it. Just, one of those things. She just read something about it, recognized the pipe, found it had the provenance, and it walked and bought it back with the help of the auction house. So these things can happen, but policies need to be put in place.
Also, another story of repatriation, the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. When the Mayo started, it was around 1862, it was around the Dakota War. And Dr. Mayo, whatever his name is, Williams, is that his, they're all Williams. He because he was a man of medicine and science, sent his people out to the graves right after the hanging of Dakota 38, and they dug up a body and brought it back and boiled it and stripped it of its flesh and had it in his office. I think it was returned in around like 2009. This is from memory, so fact check me. And the Mayo Clinic quietly repatriated it. It had been handed to a few generations before it was returned, and it wasn't until 2018 the Mayo Clinic wanted to make a scholarship for Native people going into medicine. And so they're creating this scholarship, and part of the Dakota's response and the community's response was, you cannot make a scholarship until you actually apologize, because the repatriation happened without an apology. And so in 2018, in Lincoln, Nebraska, not even in Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic apologized to whatever Native community was at that hotel when they were announcing a scholarship. There was no fanfare around that. And a lot of people don't know about it. So I think that that's another thing where you have private families that have stolen, and they have repatriated things. The other thing is we often talk about objects, but land, hashtag land back. If you want to do something in your landowner, put us in your will. Give the land back to Native people. We can put it in tribal trust. And so I'll just go really quickly. This is what I was talking about with the reverse pottery. Sorry that I'm showing you an image of one of these things. This was the catalog that never happened. It was the name of the show was Worlds Within. And we're so close. If you display a grave belonging that was stolen, you are complicit in legitimizing the act of stealing from Native people. No treaties give the United States or its citizens the right to desecrate and loot Native graves. You are perpetuating violence against Native people. And remember that rights that non-Natives have in what is now the United States are upheld in treaties. Without those treaties, nobody has any rights to be here. So treaty rights are human rights. They're the highest law of the land. It is really important to understand that. The NAGPRA says that if you have private land, you find a body on it, you can dig it up and keep Native things. NAGPRA says that. NAGPRA is wrong, because the treaties do not give anyone the right to desecrate our graves. We didn't think we had to put those in the treaties. We didn't realize. Getting into men. Settler colonialism falsely assumes that men are our leaders. Native women often challenge institutions, do the intellectual and physical labor to the detriment of our personal economies. Recognize that pattern. When we fight institutions, the institution does not reward us for that fighting. they look usually to our men and give them solo exhibitions. That's what happens. Here's an example of that. Jimmy Durham, who is not Cherokee. This is one of his pieces that I find particularly upsetting. Heid has her own favorites. Mostly because of the violence towards Pocahontas and the kind of tongue-in-cheek nature of this piece. I find it very upsetting with missing and murdered Indigenous people, or women. 1985 was a while ago. Jimmy Durham's ideas around Pocahontas was that she was valorized and she was romanticized in a way that, I don't know how to say her name, the mistress of Cortez was demonized in Central America. So he kind of plays these two women as foils of each other. So I talk about this in Galanin's show, False Dichotomy of Traditional and Contemporaries Imposed on the Work of Native People. We are denied contemporaneity. Even I just did an interview yesterday where the interviewer was talking about natives using modern materials. And I was like, what's a modern material? I couldn't figure out what on earth. And it's like, oh, because I'm native. So anything that isn't buckskin. So I think that's it's important to see how authenticity, the idea of like you're not racially performing in a way that I think is native, so therefore you are unauthentic. It's trying to locate the person who gets to say whether or not Native people are participating as authentic is located within the settler and not within Native people. We can do whatever the hell we want. So you're like, no, we can't do whatever we want.
I think part of it is that, this is me, it's like quoting myself there, that we're stuck in the past. You know, the 19th century is where natives are authentic and real, and therefore there has to be some sort of connection to that and some sort of postmodern glibness of using materials, contemporary materials. I think that's one of the reasons we get stuck in that box, whereas other artists are not questioned about materials they use. They're just not. There's no thesis to be written about using a new material necessarily, and for us it's always part of the project, and it really reveals that we are supposed to be dead and in the 19th century. Oh, these are our recent interventions that we liked. Yeah, we can't get through all of them, but they're up there.
These are our hot takes.
Yeah, they're juicy though. But some of them are works that are here. So just Rebecca Belmore in Canada, but closer to us, the Hearts of Our People exhibit, which I worked with, the work on the Daymakaaska, the Minnesota History Center opening tonight, a newly interpreted exhibit for Minnesota and placing us here and now, not just historically. And for myself, I love large-scale projections and how they really connect to land and have a very large sense of intervening with an institution. And the ones that Jonathan Thunder has done at the Tweed and also with Northern Spark, I think, are really important in that regard. So that's the quick. What else we got there? Oh yeah, just got to get images from each one. So I think we're at our question and answer time, right?
Sorry, we might go over, so be very mindful.
If you have to go, we understand.
Okay, so we're fine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to take it?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. And I'd also maybe encourage those of you who do have questions to think about ones that might be most beneficial for the room.
No questions.
None? I can run you a mic. One in the back.
Oh, I've often done this thing. Can I do it now? I wish you hadn't put up your hand. But I was going to do it before. When there's a pause, I often say, I'm willing to pause, and could you pause just a little bit longer so people whose voices aren't usually first represented take that moment to form their question and be able to speak, because almost universally. A non-native man will ask a question first, and we did this in Northwestern, and it went really badly, didn't it? We had some questions that were, but I just, in case anybody needed a little extra second to form their question. Or comment. I'm open to comments.
We
Okay.
scared everyone.
I know we scared everybody. Yes, in the back.
I apologize for being late.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I'm just wondering if you spoke about if your artwork or writing, just projects that you're working on now, if it includes this work continuing. I don't know if I phrased that in a way.
I'll just say something real quick while Andrea forms her. I have 2 books that are about museums, museum practices. Both, I wrote this one, National Monuments. That's a kind of obvious. But the national monument in it is actually the body and the native body and how it's used and referred to in indigenous cultures from all over the globe. And the last book, Curator Performer at the New Museum for Gay Media, is about technology and indigenous people and how that sort of strange anachronism of technology and our continuing indigeneity should surprise no one.
I've been thinking a lot in my writing lately about, in the past I've been very focused on these white box spaces, on museums, and on how museums are these kind of false landscapes, or these places that are supposed to convey objectivity, and then how museums collect things and tell the stories of objects, and that very powerful, the powerful control of storytelling, or the agency over our objects. But recently I've been thinking a lot more about outside, about things like Bede Makaska, and thinking about how the spaces that we occupy and the spaces that we walk through on a daily basis are full of these colonial reminders and kind of making colonization seem as always the inevitable thing, that settler futurity is unavoidable. So I've been thinking, after I've moved to Chicago, which is a very different landscape than Minneapolis when it comes to the Native community, things like founders. There's these really powerful narratives of the first settlers who settle this place, of the last of the Mohicans, the last of these people, the first of these. So Chicago, it is said, was founded by Jean-Baptiste du Sable. He was an African-American man by way of Haiti, and he came up to Chicago and founded the first trading post in Chicago. There's a Apple store where his trading post was. But I find the story very interesting because he had married Kitahawa, who was a Potawatomi woman, and he was only able to really participate off of Potawatomi sovereignty in that area. He would not have been able to live in what is now Chicago had it not been for the Potawatomi community taking him in. He's like totally valorized by Chicago as being this founder of Chicago. And I think he would, if he was alive today, be very embarrassed about that narrative because he was Potawatomi kin. He was Potawatomi family. And he is celebrated in isolation of his Potawatomi family. So that's things that I've been thinking about this kind of idea of erasing Native people. And I think it's really interesting that he opened up the first trading post when Chicago is the land of the Three Fires Council, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and Odawa. Odawa means the traders. Why were they named the traders if they did not have a trading post among them? It just seems very odd. Don't believe the story. But I really love Black and Native solidarity, and I think Chicago could be a really cool place for that. Any other questions?
I have my question. I don't need a microphone to ask this. I've been to in attendance at universities like Brown and Case Western Reserve, where they had death memorials put on display. And the most prominent one that comes to mind came from a totally different culture in China. Burial jars outside of the Adelbert registration used for all the students attending. And in the 1990s, the curse of those materials came true. The Adelbert main building burned to the ground. So there is some comeuppance, and it wasn't even hypothesized that some of the Chinese graduate students were watching this daily reminder of grave robbers every day, burned it down. It was an accident, but I think it was a curse.
Well, like you were talking earlier about our thing backfiring at Northwestern. Part of how that backfired is when Natives participate in any space, how problematic they are. So we were speaking at Northwestern on a panel that's in Evanston, Illinois, which is outside of Chicago, north of Chicago. The history of Evanston is John Evans. That's where that comes from. He was one of the architects. He was the governor of Colorado, but he was an architect of the Sand Creek Massacre, where was around 350 Native women and children were brutally butchered. And I mean, this is for sensitive people. It was beheading women, putting them on stakes, cutting fetuses out of wombs. It was taking trophies from genitalia that were being cut off, and this was a very terrible, terrible massacre. It was at a time when a lot of settlers did not like Native people, but that story, when it came back, Congress did an investigation and had a number of the soldiers testify and tell these stories of what had happened, because some soldiers did not want to participate in it. So the stories came out, their testimonies are written down. If you want to read them, you can, and they are very horrific. So John Evans was kind of run out of town. It changed the tide of attitudes towards Native people. So he went up to it and founded Evanston and Northwestern University. So we're speaking at Northwestern University, and someone in the audience, I don't know, he was kind of accusing us of like, how could you speak on a stage in this place that has this history? And we're like, everywhere you go, it's covered in blood.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just that massacre, but.
Yeah, and I mean, an interesting, I guess not an intervention, but a reparation is the movement to take the medals of valor and so forth, the war medals back from these people who committed these crimes, and the ones from Wounded Knee are the next, I think. But I do think they did rescind some of the medals from, guys are gone and dead, but still, it's a thing to be done.
We should rename Evanston Potawatomi Town.
Yeah, renaming is a big part too, and I think you at Macalester know that.
Right?
Renaming is a huge thing. Videmakiska, just so many places that recovering a name, it means a lot. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask about if you knew in terms of potential interventions, because I know that they're redoing like Fort Snelling and the idea of adding the name Ladote back to that, and I know there's like an online petition where the public can. But I was just wondering if I don't know to what degree have they, people who are in charge or whoever are doing that. I'm just wondering if you have any inside knowledge about to what degree are really Native people's voices being heard and authenticated in that process.
Yeah, I think that there's a centering now that's begun in the History Center, which is important, but these things kind of wax and wane. When I first got here, there was a lot of tension. The Indian Affairs Council was really powerful. They were intervening with Hamlin, where those bodies are, and so forth. And then suddenly there's an amnesia, there's an administrative change, there's something that just happens and people don't do that. Right now, the Minnesota History Center is centering Native voices are asserting themselves as the center. I'd prefer to think of it as our hard work making this happen. And, you know, the city of Minneapolis was excited to work with, and the Parks Board of Minneapolis were excited to work with the name restoration at the lake. But yeah, so I probably do have some sort of insider scoop, but I can't think of it right now. I just know that it goes back and forth so much, you know? Things are about to happen and then they don't happen, or, yeah. But I'm hopeful right now. It's weird that some things change while other things, you know, or some things progress while other things regress so enormously, nationally. You know, what happened at Bears Ears is such a huge travesty because it had never happened before that another president's national monument had just been given up and opened up to all sorts of problems. And it was such an important thing to happen because the coalition that built the call for that monument was all Native. And that has never happened before. We've been excluded from national monuments and national parks from the get-go. The reason the image of Native people selling their wares outside of a national park is even part of national consciousness is because we were not allowed in national parks up until the 1950s.
And now it's free for us.
Yeah, now it's free. So, but there were, you know, they just, that wasn't the image that was going to be shared with the world, was that Native people still lived in these parks. It's very strange, but that was the truth. And, you know, some of that land was the last to be stolen and so forth. So I'm sure Marty could talk about that better than I can, but anybody else?
Thank you for sharing all of your ideas that you shared tonight. My imagination is just like really expanding right now, and I loved the image of the Black Panther still. I saw this panel about the movie Black Panther at MIA. I think it was in the last year, if other people went to this, and Sean Webster said, well, maybe there just shouldn't be a museum. That was his position as I understood it. And so I'm wondering about, like, just thinking about museums and how there's often this use of language that we should transform or intervene into the museum and change it, but they're also just architecturally so static in relation to what I imagine the natural environment feels like, which is very dynamic. There's seasons, water rises and lowers. And so I wonder, just really imaginatively, like, could a museum be just like liquidated as a space and as an institution, and like, could the funds or whatever gets liquidated be transformed into something that is not a building with stuff in it? Do you know what I mean?
I love the idea of like gutting the money of institutions. So here's, I love that argument and that point. What I'm nervous about is I'm not through kicking the crap out of museums and having these conversations, and I don't want to foreclose on the hurt and the violence. I want to end the violence, but we still need to find healing, and part of that healing process is truth-telling. And so we're not quite through with the truth-telling, or we're not quite uncovering it. We still have bodies of memorized people in Minnesota that have not been returned. So we have to figure out how to put things right, and we have to come to these truths, I think. Because I'm always nervous about foreclosing on, because I'm really into Indigenous Futurism, and I keep finding these scholars who love Afrofuturism, and they want to, think of Native survival and put us in the future, but they don't know anything about our history. And Indigenous Futurism is not about foreclosing on our histories, and not about ending that truth-telling and just like glitter future. It is actually about, just as much about the past, and bringing, because right now, my ancestors, I am their future, and so I have a different capacity for being able to write some of those those wrongs, being able to identify them and call them out, whereas my ancestors were not able to. So in this current moment, we need to we really need to expose more things before we end them. And when we do, if we are able to end museums, we have to imagine that. We have to do that in a very smart, strategic way. But I like that as a goal.
I like the idea of winding down with anything Sean Webster's. I'm not the same kind of visionary, so I can't quite imagine that future, but I think one of the places people will forge that imagination is in, relationship building with institutions, cultural institutions. And I also think that it, at present, is the primary place in the United States where American school children have any content about Indigenous people at all. And for that reason, it's extraordinarily important to make sure that their meeting is dynamic and present as well as in the past. So I think that my investment, and when we say American school children, we're talking about the 70% of Native kids who go to schools outside of their reservation community. This is often their touch point to many people are distanced from their culture, and that's an absolute necessity that I think we have to be responsible to. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful.